All right. I said we're picking up with Pharaoh. We talked about Pharaoh on Wednesday night, and so there in verse 19 is where he begins to bring up Pharaoh. He says, "You will say to me then, why then does he still find fault? Who resists his will? On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Or does not the potter have right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use?" This is in response, rather, to him bringing up Pharaoh back in verses 16 and 17. So we talked about God's usage of Pharaoh, and his usage of Pharaoh being consistent with Pharaoh's own character, right? He comes to Pharaoh as someone who has decided his own path and his own heart, and God uses that heart, and only through God's interaction with him just exacerbates what Pharaoh had already brought to the table, increases or intensifies what Pharaoh had brought to the table. But he doesn't come as the Calvinist would suggest and just utterly transform and find like a lump of clay that has no characteristics whatsoever and then produces those characteristics for his own purposes, but rather uses those characteristics. Now, as we come to the usage of the clay here and its role in all of this, when we do think of a lump of clay, we do think of it as not having characteristics, unformed, right? It doesn't bring anything to the table, and anything that comes out of that lump is something that the potter makes of it. And so in this context, it could easily seem that what Paul is saying is that God comes to the table and he makes from us, before we make any choices, before we bring anything to the table, he makes from us whatever he wants to outside of our will, outside of our interaction and our choices. But there's a context to this as well. It does not, in most of your Bibles, it doesn't have the indications of this being quotation, right? As we're going through these quotations from Genesis and then Exodus, there's in the New American Standard, there's all caps. You might have quotation marks, but in this case, maybe not. However, this is the language of Jeremiah chapter 18. Not only Jeremiah chapter 18, but maybe most intensely Jeremiah chapter 18. And when we look there, we get, I think, more information. So in Jeremiah chapter 18, we have the story of the potter and the clay. So let's just read through that beginning in verse 1. Jeremiah 18, beginning in verse 1. It says, "The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will announce my words to you. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, making something on the wheel. But the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled in the hand of the potter. So he remade it into another vessel, as it pleased the potter to make. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Can I not, O house of Israel, deal with you as this potter does, declares the Lord? Behold, like clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. At one moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom, to uproot, to pull down, or to destroy it. If that nation against which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the calamity I plan to bring on it. Or at another moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom, to build up or to plant it. But if it does evil in my sight by not obeying my voice, then I will think better of the good with which I had promised to bless it. So now then, speak to the men of Judah and against the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I am fashioning calamity against you and devising a plan against you. Oh, turn back, each of you from his evil way, and reform your ways and your deeds. But they will say, It's hopeless. For we are going to follow our own plans. Each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. Now, we'll pause there in that reading. But there are several things here that are of particular value. So he tells Jeremiah to go and observe what's happening at the potter's house, right? Observe what he's doing with the clay. And as he observes, we do see the initial effort of the potter to make something out of the clay. All right, so there is that sense in which I do think God approaches all of us as lumps of clay and desires to make something of us and desires to make vessels of honor. That's certainly what he wanted for Israel, was to make vessels of honor. I think God would have us all to be made as vessels of honor. But as he is at the potter's house, what occurs as he's trying to make something out of the clay? All right, yes, it's spoiled in his hand. It's not becoming what he wants it to be. Now, here's where the illustration needs some adjusting in our minds, because what is the cause of the spoiling? The clay wouldn't have it. Now, why is that a problem for our illustration, especially if we're just taking the context of Romans chapter 9? In our minds, I mean, if somebody says you're like clay, then if we take that literally, what does that mean?
That's the only choice we got.
Right, clay has no say in the matter. But you see, Jeremiah is saying the clay does have some say in the matter, right? So we have to make an adjustment there. So now we're not talking about literal clay anymore. We're talking about clay as an illustration. There's a sense in which that clay is utterly under the master's control, and yet, as Jeremiah is presented with this clay, there's a sense in which the clay can choose to allow itself to be molded or not. But then there's other elements at play too. So I think we just need to realize that sometimes God will use inanimate objects to represent people. And Calvinists and others will then say, well, see, just like that, we don't have any free will. We are not inanimate objects, right? There's maybe an aspect of that inanimate object that correlates with us, but that doesn't mean every aspect of that inanimate object correlates with us. Dad?
I'm not an expert in pottery, but it seems to me there's clay, do your best. It's not going to cooperate. And real physical clay.
Right.
For certain things.
Right, like a sculptor coming to a piece of stone and he wants to create this, but it just doesn't, the stone won't allow it, and the clay won't allow it. And so there's an element in which that is present in the clay, but we would not then assign will to the clay, and yet we do have, right? So there's that element that's being transferred over and saying, in the way that clay will not allow itself to be molded, so people will not allow themselves to be molded in certain ways, right? So there's characteristics there. Now, so as he goes on and he talks about that what Jeremiah is seeing there. Now God goes further and he steps away from the potter's will, and he says, so there are times when I might pronounce what against a nation? All right, so at one moment I might speak concerning a nation to uproot, to pull down, or to destroy it, judgment and wrath. Now, what will change God's mind, the potter's mind, concerning that?
They turn against their evil.
Right, so if they change, then the potter. In other words, if the clay becomes malleable, then God will continue to try to create the vessel of honor. On the flip side, what else might he say concerning a nation?
I'm going to bless you, but if you turn against me, then I'll break this in.
Yeah, so he might pronounce blessings on a nation, but if they turn away from their righteousness, again, now that clay is hardening itself up. All right, well, then I can use that too. And the point is that God is saying here, you do have choices in this relationship. But here's the choice you don't have. You don't get to say, I'm going to harden myself and refuse to be molded in this fashion, but I still want to be a vessel of honor. You see, that's That's where God's sovereignty does come in. He says, you don't get to decide to behave this way and get this outcome. He is still over the result, right? So your choices, he's over the consequences. This is what we ought to be trying to communicate to our children, right? As we communicate to them consequences, that they have some control over the consequences. Now, we are the ultimate arbiters. When I say they have some control, it's not that they can behave any old way and then say, but no, I'd prefer not to be grounded. Well, obviously. But the way that you control that is to decide to obey. You don't get to decide to go down this path, but then not get to where that path leads. You know, I'm going to go down this path, but I want to get to the end of that road over there. Well, the only way to do that is to go down that road over there, right? You can't just change the rules of physics, as it were. And that's the potter again, right? I want to be this kind of clay, but formed into this kind of vessel. And the potter says, no. If you're this kind of clay, I'm going to make this kind of vessel out of you. But the other part of the sovereignty there with regards to God is that it's not as though God is forming a certain type of vessel, and when it's spoiled in his hand, he says, well, I just can't use this. No, he says, no, I can make something of you. Now, you won't like what I'm about to make of you, but I can. I will use you. And God continues to use Israel even in their unfaithfulness, as he continues to use all nations in their faithfulness or unfaithfulness. We see that with Nineveh. In the story of Jonah, God uses the penitence of Nineveh to teach something to his people. Then in Nahum, God uses the impenitence of Nineveh to teach something to his people. And so it's not as if God can only use you if you will comply. It's more of God can use you no matter what. It's just you may not enjoy the way he's using you depending on how you comply or reject. Does that make sense as far as God being in control? God is in control of the consequences. He's not in control of your decisions. He's not deciding whether or not you will obey or reject, but rather he is deciding what the consequences of that will be, what the outcome. Finally, look at verse 12 of Jeremiah 18. They will say, it is hopeless, for we are going to follow our own plans, and each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. Now, who is saying that? Israel. They're saying, we're going to do this no matter what. We can't change. God is not saying that. They are. I find that this is, I think, not an infrequent theme, that God calls his people to change. And it is never God saying, you can't. There's no way that you can. It's always the people saying, we don't. How do we change? We can't. We're just going to be what we are. And so God offers options. God offers life and death. He offers choices. And it is always the people who deny that there is choice. People are still denying that today. And it's not just Calvinists. It's people all across the spectrum who say, we don't have choices. We can't help what we are. And God says, you can. I'm giving you the option. Even in the book of Malachi, that's one of the things that the people say. How can we return? I mean, we are what we are. We are where we are. And so that sort of static role, that static character of men is not taught by God, but rather it is erroneously believed by men. And so here in this chapter in Romans chapter 9, this being sort of maybe one of the most key parts of that chapter, that people who believe in meticulous sovereignty, they would just camp out right there. Look, we are clay. He is the potter. He does whatever he wants to. And I think, I know that a lot of these men are not biblically illiterate. And so when you read this, it is almost comical that when we get to the end of this section that says the very opposite of those things, that says it is within your choice, I will react to what you are doing, that at the end of it all, the unfaithful Israelites are essentially saying the very things that the Calvinists say Paul is saying in Romans chapter 9. And it's not true. It isn't hopeless unless they reject. I think that is helpful to bring that context into Romans chapter 9. Not just helpful, but vital to bring that context in. Any thoughts on that before we move on to this next element? Michael?
A phrase that I heard once upon a time was, you can't sow your wild oats during the week and expect crop failure on Sunday.
Yeah.
And the same concept on the other side of that is, we've got to sow to the good in order to receive the good. And so it's indicative of this area just to kind of keep in mind of what they're doing in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so ultimately, it is a pronouncement of God is not mocked, right? Whatever a man sows, that he will reap. And so that's the element here of God's control, God's sovereignty, that he will make sure that the crops come in that you have sown. Okay. So he talks about making one vessel for honorable use, another for common use. That is, it could be translated profane use. It's the idea of the difference, talking about clay vessels, the difference between a pitcher that you put on the table to serve your guests or the bowl in the restroom. Which do you want to be? Which the honorable or the dishonorable? So, who are then the vessels of wrath that Paul is speaking of here in verse 22? The common vessels.
This would be those Jews who have rejected God's will for them.
Right. So, all along, all throughout the Old Testament, God is indicating these are the glories that I would like to prepare you for. They reject all of that. Okay. Here's the other option. And that's what we've come to in Romans chapter 9 is the other option. And again, it's not that what he is saying is you were always determined to be vessels of wrath. That goes against everything we've known about Israel up to this point. God had to be lying in everything he said about Israel up to this point if they were always meant to be vessels of wrath. Rather, it is you have utterly and repeatedly and consistently rejected God's offers to be vessels of honor. And so the other option, the other choice is vessels of wrath, prepared for destruction. And it says in verse 23 that he did this to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. And so, who then, in this context, are the vessels of honor? Going back to the illustration here. Well, the Gentiles are included. Yeah, it's Christians, right? Among Jews and Gentiles. It's New Israel. So the vessels of honor end up being exactly what God has been describing them to be the whole time, right? We talked about that on Wednesday night, that under the law, God described who his people ought to be. They never did live up to that description, but through the prophets, he says, one day I will have it. And through Christ, he does. And so Israel, unfaithful Israel, those who continue in the paths as Jesus convicted the leaders, Jewish leaders of his day, they are the sons and daughters of those who killed the prophets. They're following in the paths of unfaithful Israel. They will be the vessels of dishonor. And finally, these will be the vessels of honor. Now, how does, in verse 23, making them the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, how does that make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy? How does their destruction, highlight or help this other aspect?
There's a tremendous distinction between the two.
Okay? Yep. Trevor?
And I think also there's a tie back to the enduring in the verse before. God put up with this for a long time when there was every right to wipe them out. But he had a plan to bring forth the Messiah through these people and then ultimately save and redeem his people. And so I think also that endurance, that forbearance is the other thing that shows his mercy and his glory.
Yeah, so, right. And all along, Paul's been making that case that he has waited so long. And even here in chapter 9, that's how we started. He's waited so long for this. And so this is not undeserved. In fact, this is at the end of a very long stretch of mercy. I would add to that, that as we come into the New Testament, as we come to Christ, the other thing that Paul has been doing is comparing this path of unfaithful Israel with this path of faithful Christians, those who have come to Christ through the very same faith of Abraham. Now, if God keeps both of those on the table and on the same level, what does that communicate? Do it? Yeah. Yeah, one is as good as the other. And so, as we come to Christ, you can't hold this up there and continue to pretend that this is also faithfulness, that this is also a legitimate way to define being the people of God. No, in order to show that this has to be taken away, that this is glorious, that this is what God meant the whole time, this can't stand side by side with it any longer. And I think ultimately when we get to the destruction of Jerusalem, that is what God is doing, is finally taking that out of the way. There is no room for competition anymore. There's no room after the destruction of Jerusalem for people to say, well, yeah, both ways are good. No. Obviously that way is not good. That way ended in destruction. And so it removed any sane argument that says this is a path to glory. This is a path to God. This stands alone as the path to God. And so bringing them ultimately to that destruction takes away the false confidence and false notion that you can find your way to God through this unfaithful path of unfaithful Israel, that there's only one path. And it goes all the way back, of course, as we said, to Abraham and David and other faithful Israelites coming now to faithfulness in the faithful Jew, that is Jesus Christ. Well, he quotes here Hosea, I will call on those who were not call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved. And it shall be that in that place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. And so we bring forward here in the prophecy of Hosea, of course, this is in response to the children who were named not my people, not beloved, or no compassion, would be the way it would be translated in Hosea. And now we see that being applied where there was this transition of rejection to reception in the book of Hosea concerning the children of Israel. Now that is brought forward to the Gentiles particularly, where there is that rejection. They are not my people. Now they are brought in and they are made my people. Now, in that context, in the book of Hosea, chapter 2, when he is coming off of the names of those children, Lo Ammi and Lo Ruhamah, and then he says they shall be called my people and they shall be called beloved. What is the context? What's the very next words? You remember there back in Hosea chapter 2? This is chapter 2 and verse 2. The ones who say to your brothers, Ammi, and your sisters, Ruhamah. That is, instead of Lo Ammi, not my people, say my people. Say to your sisters, compassion, where there was no compassion. Then what? What should those children do?
Bring charges against their mother.
Yeah. Contend with your mother, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And so as these Gentiles are being brought in who are afar off, one of the arguments that Paul is making here and will continue on is that they need to turn to unfaithful Israel, through whom, in a sense, they come, right? There's a sense in which they are sharers of what Israel has preserved, but their mother is unfaithful. And so they're to turn around and contend with unfaithful Israel. And as we get to chapter 11, we see this interaction where here the Jews are put out, the Gentiles are brought in, and the goal is that they might bring the Jews in as well, that they might bring unfaithful Israel back into the fold. And so as we're looking here in Romans chapter 9 and all this condemnation and Israel's going to be destroyed, what is all this preaching being done for? And this pointing to the Gentiles, it's so that they might wake up and that they might not suffer the destruction that is coming. Again, speaking to the sovereignty of God and going back to what we looked at in Jeremiah chapter 18, the whole point of really every proclamation of destruction is not to say this is going to happen no matter what you do, but rather this is going to happen and I'd like you to escape it. That's God's proclamation to Nineveh through Jonah. Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. There is no if there. There is no contingency plan there. But what is the assumption of the Ninevites? We're being told this so that we might avoid it. And they're right. And they make the adjustments and so that they do avoid the destruction that Jonah has prophesied. And so here is Paul preaching this destruction. And I'm not saying that it seems to me it's much like in the days of Jeremiah. It's coming. But Paul is preaching to those who he hopes might avoid it, that they may not participate in the destruction that's coming, and that they might look to those Gentiles coming in and be motivated by that instead of angered by that, which it seems most of them were. They were made jealous, but not with a good jealousy. And we'll come back to that argument again in chapter 11. Well, coming down to verse 27 then, it says, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly. So you think back to the promise to Abraham of his descendants being like the sands of the sea, and that promise of the vastness and the greatness of the nation. And yet, as we get to the period of judgment in Israel's history, the captivity, and then the return to the captivity, the focus does shift from that picture of largeness to that picture of quality over quantity, if you will. That it is the faithful remnant that will be saved. And so Paul brings up that language very consistently throughout this text. Again, coming from here all the way into chapter 11, as he brings up Elijah and the 7,000 who had not bowed the knee. He's not speaking of that in terms of, wow, there's 7,000, but rather there's only 7,000. And so there may be few, but there will be those few. And he longs to save those few. But Israel as a whole will be judged. Same thing with captivity, right? Were there faithful people during captivity? Yeah, we see some of them, and they're highlighted in Daniel and in Ezekiel. We get pictures of faithfulness during the destruction of Jerusalem and during captivity. But the picture is overall one of unfaithfulness, of course. Even Jeremiah, as he preaches during the days of Josiah, says there's not a man. I can't find a single faithful man in the whole city. Well, we know that there are faithful people during that period, but there's not many. There's so not many that you could rightfully say Israel's unfaithful. And I think the same in Paul's day. Are there faithful Jews in Paul's day? Well, yeah, Paul's one of them. That's one of the arguments he's going to make. But what will we say? What is the pronouncement on Israel as a whole? They're unfaithful. I think that, again, is the picture we have to keep of the whole of Romans and all the arguments Paul is making about the law and about their relationship to the law. It is the relationship of an unfaithful people to the law. The Pharisees are not faithful people. Sometimes we think of Paul because he says, for instance, I've lived in all good conscience. Paul is a good man. Well, there may be some sense in which that's right. But in another sense, he is a man who, while living in good conscience, did everything he could to destroy God's plan. That's a wicked man. That is an unfaithful man. And so, in so much as Paul viewed the law, and he viewed it as zealously carrying out the law, his view of the law was such that it demanded that he diametrically oppose God. Now, you think about that. That somebody has a view of the law, of God's law, that keeping God's law means I have to work against God. So, don't think that what Paul is saying is here are Jews, they're just trying their best, they're trying to follow the law, and they just can't get to God. No, here are people who had it all wrong. They didn't understand the law, they didn't understand God through the law, and the result is they're unfaithful people. And here come the Gentiles, and somehow, without all that history and all that advantage that you Jews have had, they got it. And they accepted him. And you didn't. And what does that say? And I think that's really going to be the argument of chapter 10 for the most part as we get there. Picking up then in verse 29. Just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left to us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah. Two questions there. One, the question I've written, first of all, why had they not become like Sodom and Gomorrah? And additionally, what does Sodom and Gomorrah represent to Israel in their history, in their literature? Right. The judgment, the righteous judgment of God. You bring up Sodom and Gomorrah, and an Israelite would say, that's what happens when you deny God. That's what happens when you reject God and go your own way. God brings judgment. And so for Paul, I mean, they are the epitome of that, right? So Paul bringing that up and saying, you would be like that. And he's not just bringing it up out of his own head. He's bringing it up out of Isaiah. So why had they not become like Sodom and Gomorrah? Because they're more righteous? Why? Pardon? For a remnant to be saved? Yeah. Well, because a few were righteous. But notice he says, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left to us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and... All right, so he preserved them. The Lord left them a posterity. And ultimately, why did he do that? That's right. I got a plan. I got to get to the end of it. It is not for their sakes. It is not even because there are a few righteous, though they could have been saved. It's not for their own sakes. It's to get us to Christ. And the whole point of Romans chapter 9 is we're done with the plan. There's no need to keep hanging on to Israel anymore. She served her purpose. And so God preserved her in her unrighteousness to get us to here. But what we deserved was to be Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what Israel deserved. All right, so we've got to that point. Now, verse 30, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. Now, first of all, what does it say they did not arrive at? Yeah, they didn't arrive at the law. Not just they didn't arrive at Christ, they didn't even arrive at the law, all right? So again, going back, we've been comparing the law and righteousness, the law and Christ, and what he's saying is you missed the law. Now, why did they miss the law? Because they pursued it by works and not by faith. That throws a whole wrench into the notion that the law is works and Christ is not. No, the law obviously includes works, but it includes faithful works. It includes a faithful approach to the law, and it's the same approach that would get you to Christ. So when he's saying you miss Christ, it's not because you were faithful to the law. You miss Christ because you were unfaithful to the law. And if you've been faithful to the law, you would have arrived at Christ, just like all faithful Israel did arrive at Christ. And so Paul's point is not, you guys, you're just really stuck on the law. His overall point of Israel is you never even got it then, which is why you don't get it now. So they were unfaithful to the law, which led to unfaithfulness to Christ. It's a consistent pattern that brings them to that point. All right. We'll pick up in chapter 10 on Wednesday. Appreciate everybody's good attention.